It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. I'm the president of Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. You can find a link to my work at emailrevealer.com. You can also get an autographed copy of my book there, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator, all kinds of asset searches and locates and adoption investigations. Emailrevealer.com. Okay, very excited about today's show. We have Sean MacLeod. He's the author of the book Behind the Wall of Illusion. And it's about the Beatles and about their religious involvement, their occult involvement, and all kinds of stuff we've always been fascinated about here at the Opperman Report. So we're really happy to get Sean MacLeod. He has a history of writing books about music. A couple, Phil Spector, Sound of the 60s. I'm a big Phil Spector fan, you know that. And the other one is Leaders of the Pack, girl groups of the 1960s and their influence on popular culture in Britain and America. Good old Ronnie Spector, man. I tell you, I can't listen to Ronnie Spector without singing along. So we got Sean MacLeod. Mr. MacLeod, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Ed.
Thank you so much. Tell the audience who you are. Who is Sean MacLeod?
Sean MacLeod is, he comes from Ireland, Dublin originally, but now in the last 10 years I've been living in the west of Ireland, County Limerick, which is, I suppose, very, very old country type of place. And I am a musician and a writer, and written 3 books now on popular music and culture. And I also I lecture in the university here and in what they call the Further Education College in music, film, media, that kind of thing. So that's my background.
So when you describe it as the old country, is this like farm country?
Yeah, it's quite rural. Not so developed as what you might consider Limerick is a city. It's the 3rd city in Ireland, but it's just really a small street with a couple of shops and then a lot of countryside. A really big river goes through it called the Shannon, which is the biggest river in the British Isles. We get a lot of rain here, a lot more than they get on the Dublin side. We're closer to you guys in America, and it's wet, but it's nice being in the country, you know.
Yeah, I have a grandmother from Ireland. Yeah, my grandmother grew up on a farm in Ireland. Now the website to get this book is called LimerickWritersCenter.com, and
the Limerick Writers Centre, which actually was originally kind of funded by a guy called Frank McCourt, who is quite well-known author, very big in America. He wrote a book called Angela's Ashes.
Oh, sure, okay.
Yeah. So the Limerick Writers Centre has a kind of a bit of a history in trying to promote, I guess, culture here, and particularly, the written word here in Limerick. So that's why I was kind of interested to see what would happen if I kind of went with a local kind of collective like the Limerick Writers Centre. So if I brought this book to them, I was curious to see how that would work out from the point of view of sales, promotion, and that. Just working with a collective rather than a big publishing company, which is what the other 2 books were with.
Yeah, and the book is called Behind the Wall of Illusion, and people need to be aware it's not available on Amazon, so you have to go to this website, Limerick Writers Centre, and center is spelled the old English way, C-E-N-T-R-E, not the American way, the way we spell things, C-E-N-T-E-R. Okay. So what can we find in this book, Behind the Wall? It's about the Beatles, right? And they're religious and occult. Yeah, so what did you come up with?
What did I come up with?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose one interest of mine for a long time has been with philosophy, which my degree was in English and philosophy, actually. And when I left university, I kind of came across kind of a philosophical view of a guy called Rudolf Steiner, which people in America might know him through the Waldorf education or Steiner schools, things like that. He's kind of mostly known for that, but his interests span across every conceivable topic, from farming to beekeeping to drama to music to religion to etc., etc. So he became kind of a big influence on me, and I suppose it's really a way of kind of seeing and living in the world. In a movement called anthroposophy, which means the wisdom of man. So kind of looking at ourselves, looking at how the human being is, how it works in the world, and that is a kind of a blueprint for how things, in a sense, should work in the world. So that's how societies should organise themselves, etc. So this became a kind of big interest to me, as the Beatles were since when I was a kid. So they kind of opened up the door to me in relation to music. And that kind of led into, what John Lennon was reading, or what other groups at the time, that I got to know through the Beatles were what was influencing that culture. So that kind of led me on a road into literature and philosophy. And so it's kind of bringing all that, I suppose, that whole background of mine together that this book it does. And I guess, the 60s were a huge time when there was, tremendous changes culturally. And I think from the perspective of Rudolf Steiner or anthroposophy, they would kind of see, well, what were the things behind these cultural changes? What, in a sense, spiritual forces were activated through those cultural changes? And of course, the big one to start it off was World War II, because that in itself is a spiritual act that's manifested itself on the planet, and so it changes the whole nature and the whole fabric of society afterwards. And I've always been kind of interested then in looking at, where my own culture, my own growing up in the 80s, that period, obviously, what came from that, and where did that come from? Which I guess, the 60s, 70s, 80s, leads into that. So trying to get an understanding more of the time I'm living in and the culture I'm living in. And from those perspectives really influenced me, the Rudolf Steiner one and the Beatles and things like that. So I think the 60s was very much a time of change, and very much once the war had ended and all the things that started to change, it kind of flowered from my perspective in the 60s. And so a huge cultural revival, I think, like a kind of a mini renaissance. And so with that, obviously, of course, comes, kind of you have a new way of thinking, a new kind of religion, in a sense. And I think one of the main aspects of that new culture was this kind of youth culture, which brought with them, I think, rock and roll and cinema and all these kind of popular things that we take for granted now, in a way, were suddenly exploded, with Elvis, and then I think found their kind of biggest expression in the 60s. But that was kind of a religion, I think, to young people. It was something that they found more could express their way of life. It meant more to them. They were kind of closer to it. They could participate in it. They could trust it more so than maybe the more established religions, particularly in America and Britain and that at the time. I think they kind of lost faith in those institutions. So rock and roll kind of came to replace it. So from that perspective, the book starts with the Beatles growing up in Liverpool, embracing this kind of new religion of rock and roll and popular culture. That was the first thing I felt.
Sean, before we get too far ahead, you described World War II as a spiritual act. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think, it's like if somebody goes through a crisis in their lives, it's something that we can see as something at the time is very dark, isn't it? You have a personal crisis, maybe you lose somebody close to you, or you're just in a very difficult situation, and it can really just happen. I think one minute everything's fine, and the next thing, your whole world can be turned upside down. And I guess these are kind of doors opening, or something is being. There's a change, there's a shift going on, and sometimes I guess we don't make it through those crises, but more often than not we do. And when we come out the other side, we're kind of glad they're over. But I think when we look back on them, we realise how much we've grown through them. And so to me, that's the kind of a spiritual development of the human being. Your own individual biography has many of those in it. And if people don't have them, I think, they're either not really they're not really paying attention to what's going on in their lives, or, they're very necessary. So each country has them as well. I mean, obviously America had quite a number of them. The Irish have had a lot of them. Every country has them. And so the world, I think, has had them on globally, a collective, experience. And World War I and World War II were definitely crises that the whole world was facing, and out of which something changed. And I think what changed there was, what changed mostly was this sense of freedom. Freedom was one of the things that developed out of that. Freedom of expression, personal freedom, freedom that was fought for through those wars. Freedom, for example, we had in Europe, freedom to travel came out of that. We can travel anywhere in Europe now. The nation states began to kind of loosen, and Europe became a big state, like in a way America is. But before that, you couldn't cross borders. That didn't happen until the 70s. But that grew out of certain treaties and pacts that came out of World War II. So it led to a lot of things, that were a revival, not a revival isn't the right word, but a kind of a resurrection of things in a sense. Something new happened, and I think one thing that really happened was youth. The youth suddenly became, we suddenly had a youth. We suddenly had. You didn't go from being a kid to being an adult at the age of 18. We now have this period of finding ourselves, in a sense, and of like giving ourselves time to think about things. And we don't go. We're not like, we have that space, and that is something I think the youth suddenly had a voice. I think as well, But at the same time, there's a negative side to that. I think where it kind of gets a little bit manipulated, and that's something I think that I look at in that book as well, that aspect of things.
Now, okay, I guess you could describe the World War II era as like a trauma. There was an international trauma to the earth, and everyone was like in shock over it, And then after trauma, we're often open to new ideas, or even open to mind control. We're open to manipulation. And do you believe that this new, like you said, this new renaissance, this new counterculture, this new thing, that we're having trouble describing, but this new thing, this thing in the air that was there with this youth counterculture and all this, do you think that was organic or constructed by some kind of overseeing manipulation?
Well, I mean, I guess this is my opinion. So it's just my own opinion on it is that. Well, first of all, sorry. This first thing I'm going to say is not my opinion. I think it's fact. If anybody just looks at the world and looks at themselves, I think we do have, for want of a better word, we don't want to get into the semantics of things. We have good and we have bad. They are relative in that, as I said before, you could experience a crisis, something bad can happen to you, but that could lead to something good later on down the road. And often you read about people, of course, who've had a bad experience, but then they overcame that experience and it led them on to some kind of great, where they are today. And they recognize that was the moment that